Hey all, welcome to my talk today about kind engineering and how to engineer kindness in your companies. Before we start, I want to talk a bit about why I chose to do this talk and the structure of the talk today. So, software engineering is an environment that is rife with worrying stereotypes like the brilliant jerk and the Peter principle. And I kept coming back to this question of how do you be a kind engineer and encourage kindness in engineering? So, for the last couple of years, I've been exploring what it means to be a kind engineer, and it's called different things in different circles, but ultimately it comes down to the fact that people who give more unconditionally make themselves happier, their teams happier, and their companies happier. So today I'd like to share some practical tips on how people can become kinder engineers. And to do that, we're going to go through 6 sections. So to start with, there's going to be a little bit of an intro with a bit about kindness in general, a bit about me, and then we're going to hop into 4 sections that will cover code reviews, psychological safety, giving and receiving feedback, and honesty in the workplace. And then at the end, there'll be a little bit of a further reading section in case you're interested in learning more about anything we talked about today, as well as a bit of an outro, just to wrap things up and give you a summary. So without further ado, let's hop right into it. First of all, just a little bit about me. My name's Evan Smith. I'm originally from Ireland, been in Berlin for about 2 years now. I'm a site reliability engineer and a massive nerd, and I'm trying my best to be a kind engineer. To help understand what kindness is, I really love this quote from Tanya Riley's talk Continuous. Kind is about being invested in other people. It's about figuring out how to help them and meeting them where they are. And you'll see throughout today that last bit is a recurring theme. You'll see it again and again about putting yourself in their shoes. It's about actively caring about people, getting invested in making them better, and going that extra mile. There's a difference between being nice and kind. I mean, be nice and kind. Be nice as much as possible. Meetings and work and everything go better when people are trying to be agreeable and friendly with each other. But go further than that. Actively care about people and get invested in making them better. Go that extra mile to help someone. We all know the old adage about nice guys finish last, so you might be asking yourself, what has kindness ever done for me? And to answer that, I really love recommending this book by Adam Grant. It's called Give and Take. He divides the world into 3 different types of people. There's givers who give more than they take, there's takers who take more than they give, and there's matchers who give as much as they take. And it's filled with these studies, these stories, and these anecdotes that support the fact that givers end up more productive, they create more meaningful relationships and networks, they're more likely to receive help when they need it, they're more successful, and they're just generally happier. To start with, we're going to talk a bit about code reviews. They're one of the most powerful asynchronous communication tools we have in engineering, and it's very important that we nail the tone and how we use the method to effectively communicate with our team. One of the most important skills you're going to have to master for code reviews is your tone. First of all, try to understand more of the why and not just the what and the how. You need to understand more of where someone's coming from. You need to meet them where they are to help them and to give them a chance to explain the reasoning behind changes, behind certain pieces of code, and the reasoning that went into it. What was the process that led to this? And secondly, you should not assume malice or ineptitude. We don't hire bad engineers. We don't hire evil engineers. Don't go into a review assuming that someone is making a change out of malintent or because they're stupid or because they don't know what they're doing or they're bad at their job. It's more likely that, and leading into point 3, you should assume you might be missing something. It's more likely that you are missing something in this context and that you should just ask for clarification rather than correction. Ask for someone to explain more about their viewpoint, not in an aggressive or pointed way, but just ask more for them to clarify about what the thought process was, what the logic was going into this. Which leads me into point 4, which is that you should ask open-ended questions. Questions that leave people room to defend themselves, to explain their viewpoint, to get you on board. Ask questions that clarify a situation and ask them in an open-ended fashion. So asking questions like, have you thought about, or what would happen if we did it this way, or I see it like it's done like this, what would you think about doing it like this? Those kind of questions are open-ended and they leave enough room for someone to explain their choices explain their reasoning behind things, and bring you on board and bring you to their level and explain things to you. And while we're talking about intent, something you're going to need to do is to ensure that the reviewee understands your intent when you make certain comments. One of the most common ones is nitpicks. So nitpicks, for those who don't know, are unimportant comments where the code could be merged without even addressing them. They're those little kind of crumbs on top of code that would make it that bit better, that would take it the extra mile, that will help you grow in kind of small increments when you've already achieved kind of like a stable level of mastery over programming. And so what you can do is, number one, clearly identify and call out your nitpicks. Make sure that they're labeled correctly so that the reviewee understands that this is a nitpick that could be ignored if they're not in the right headspace, or it's just more important to get the feature out the door today. Things like that. And secondly, a lot of nitpicks may be a sign of a larger problem, such as with your tooling, your process, or your standards. If you find yourself leaving a lot of comments around like indentation or brackets on the wrong line, or this doesn't fit like with our standards of formatting, then maybe you should consider adding an automatic step, either through a pre-commit hook or through your CI pipeline that catches these things automatically and highlights them to the author of the PR rather than having you kind of go through it. This helps a lot with tone because we're often more accepting of when an automated process highlights these kind of small little bits here and there than we are when people do it. I mentioned earlier how code reviews were one of the most powerful asynchronous communication methods we have, but they have shortcomings and they have limits. So it's important to understand when to switch over to synchronous communication. So for instance, if you have a lot of questions or if you have a lot of comments, you should reach out directly to the author. Because one, some people don't like a lot of public criticism. Even if it's in a PR on like GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket, or whatever you use, people can feel like that's a public forum, and they can feel a little bit of attacked when it's on display for everyone to read. Secondly, a lot of questions can indicate that there's a misunderstanding here. You might just be talking past each other. There might be a tiny piece of the puzzle that one of you is just not getting, which leads into number 3, which is that a long back and forth of questions and answers is exhausting, and talking will be a lot quicker for both of you. It's going to be a lot easier to ask a lot of small questions in a face-to-face situation. It's going to be a lot easier to clear up that misunderstanding about what's missing in this context. The second section today is about honesty, and about being honest in a way that's not hurtful or mean and helps people grow. Being honest starts with yourself and being at work. When you're at work, you should try to be and strive to be more than just professional. Care about people and share more than just your work self, and encourage everyone to do the same. It's about building up a relationship of trust. It's about understanding people and getting closer to understanding where they come from, their life experiences, their history, how they feel and how they act, and how you can best help them in the workplace. You need to be more than just professionals together. You need to have a certain amount of connection, a certain amount of sharing to ensure that when it comes down to it, you can trust that when you give them critical feedback, that they can trust it, that they will take it on board and learn from it. And similarly, when they give you critical feedback, you need to be able to understand it and accept it, especially with praise. We don't trust praise from people when we think it's superficial or that it's insincere. We need to trust the people who praise us and criticize us in order to take their feedback on board and understand it and, build from it. And secondly, when it comes to being at work, you need to challenge people directly. Always challenge people directly. Go to the person you disagree with and challenge them about what you disagree with. Don't just focus on the negatives. You should be sure to, one, include positives when things happen. We have a tendency to always only focus on the negative things. When things are going wrong, we critique people and try to give them feedback to help them grow, but you also need to be there when things are going well. And you need to help them understand that this is great, this is a really cool thing, and give them that praise that they deserve. And secondly, as part of that, you should also be humble. You should always admit when you're wrong, when you've made a mistake. When you challenge people directly, more often than not, they're probably going to give you back an argument that will change your opinion, that will fill in some of the gaps you had, because that's the point of challenging someone directly, is you get the truth from the source. And admitting when you're wrong is going to be a very valuable skill, because it's probably going to happen a lot. And it's something that you need to get comfortable with, and you need to get comfortable with accepting. And finally, as on this slide at least, white lies aren't evil, but they're not going to help people grow. Being insincere about your compliments, about your praise, is going to be really tough for both you and them. If after a meeting someone really bombed that meeting and didn't get their point across, but they seem really nervous and you just want to build them up and you want to give them the confidence to keep doing more meetings like that, telling them that was a great meeting isn't going to help them. In fact, it's going to do the opposite, and it's going to ruin your relationship with them, because eventually what will happen is maybe they were trying to convince a group of people to take on a new architecture decision or something, and then those people reject the decision and they're kind of left being like, why? And then someone comes forward and says, well, it's because the meeting didn't go well and because you performed poorly at the meeting. And then they'll have in the back of their mind, why did Evan say that was a really great meeting if it wasn't? Why were they being insincere? Why were they lying to me? And then that's going to burden your relationship. It's going to mark it with something that you're going to have to work even harder to reconcile. And the next time around, they're probably not going to trust you when you give them praise or you give them critical feedback. So you need to understand that it's all about building relationships and building rapport with people. Being more than just your professional self is about forming a connection with people. Encouraging people to do the same is about fostering that connection between everyone so that they trust each other when it's important. It's important to hone the skill of being honest only when it helps. You shouldn't be brutally honest all the time because people need a rest. People can't deal with constant negativity. It's bad for them. You shouldn't lie to them, but you shouldn't constantly be burdening them with advice or feedback. And one of the most common things is this difference between those white lies I talked about, being nice versus being kind. So this is that meeting example I talked about, where a meeting didn't actually go well, but someone came out of it, and you want to kind of empathize with them and build them up a bit. So you say, good job in the meeting, it was great. And then later down the line, they get the real feedback, which was that it wasn't great. They didn't do well. Whereas something that's much more kind is about developing that point, about being honest with them and saying things like, your answer to the question was a bit rambly and you missed the opportunity to convince the people at the table about your idea, but it is a good idea. And all you need to do is just practice your elevator pitch. Like once you get your elevator pitch down, I really think convincing people will be a lot easier for you. I really love the idea, and I love how you did X, or I love how you did Y, and how you got up in front of people. It was great. But you do need to work on minimizing how many tangents you go on and how much rambling you do, and kind of make it much more succinct so that people have a concrete point that they go away from the meeting with. We're not being brutally honest all the time, without any filter. Being honest when it helps is about adding your empathy to feedback. It's about understanding where they are, and it's about understanding how they feel and how their emotions are, and putting yourself in their shoes when they're about to receive it, so that you make sure that you get the right time, that you if they're not feeling good after the meeting, that you let them settle for a bit and then talk to them, or that you prepare them, or that you ask them and get their consent for the feedback so that they're in a place where they're open to it. You don't want to bombard people with honesty, because you're going to seem like a dick. It's the honest truth, is that if you're honest too much and all the time without any filter, without any empathy, or without any consideration for people, they're just going to think you're a bit of a dick. They're going to think you're a bit of a jerk when it comes to helping. This next section is about psychological safety. Psychological safety is a personal favorite topic of mine. It comes up a lot in my job, and it's super useful to know about and understand. For those who don't know, psychological safety is the counterpart to physical safety. People can feel like that's a public forum, and they can feel a little bit of attacked when it's on display for everyone to read. Secondly, a lot of questions can indicate that there's a misunderstanding here. You might just be talking past each other. The physical part of ourselves we need to nurture. Psychological safety is the other side of it. It's about feeling safe in your workplace. It's about feeling like you belong, like you were included. It's about feeling okay to put your hand up and challenge people. It's about feeling safe to put your hand up and say that there is a problem or that you have caused a problem and be able to fix it. It's one of those things we have come to take for granted in healthy companies that is obviously seriously lacking in newer and less mature organizations. It's often something that people happen upon by chance, but there are ways to create it. And so this next section is 4 different pillars which you can use to create and improve the psychological safety in your organization or team. One of the first things I'd like to talk about is encouraging feedback. This is feeding on from the last couple sections. You should be the first to ask for feedback, and especially negative feedback. After a project ends or after a meeting or a presentation, take some time to gather feedback. Something I really like is the structure of a sprint retrospective. So it's what should I start doing, what should I stop doing, or what should I keep doing? Which is basically just what went badly, what went well, what can we do in the future? It's a really easy mental model to get feedback for, because it's really easy to answer those kind of questions and get people to answer those kind of questions. Highly recommended. And by seeking out criticism, you make yourself vulnerable and more open. You build and sustain that relationship that we've worked really hard to cultivate in the honesty section. By seeking out criticism, you make yourself vulnerable and more open. It builds up a rapport with people, makes them more amenable to criticism from you or for you. It counters the whole, you can dish it out, but you can't take a problem. It's about building off that relationship that we had in the honesty section that we spent a while cultivating and actually using it. Second of all, try your best to be inclusive. Keep an eye out for people who maybe don't contribute as much in meetings or in documents, and try to find ways to give them a voice. It might be just prompting them for feedback in the meeting, or maybe you need to reevaluate how people contribute entirely. Be open to different backgrounds and different life experiences by talking to them and offering to cater to their preferred style of suggestions and communication. This is all about that theme of meeting people where they are, of walking a mile in their shoes. Not everyone feels comfortable being outspoken in a meeting, so maybe sharing documents beforehand or providing an anonymous suggestion form would give them a space to make their opinion heard. Give people a voice by letting them express themselves in whatever format they feel is right. Then bringing those ideas to a central point, a meeting, a document, a dance-off, whatever is appropriate for your team and organization. It's about listening to them, listening to their experiences, listening to their life history, and understanding what works best for them, and catering to that specific need. Thirdly, you should strive to make your culture blameless. Often an individual failure is actually a failure of either process or environment or workflow. An old manager used to tell me that we put you in the position to make that mistake or push that commit, and that is why the team takes ownership over it. We succeed together and we fail together. And ultimately, people feel safer pulling out problems with the process or the workflow or the pipeline when they know they won't be blamed for when things go wrong. Because things do go wrong, it's inevitable. And often it is more a problem with the process or the responsibility we put on them than it is with the individual. Maybe we didn't highlight enough information for them. Maybe we gave them the wrong information at deploy time. Maybe we said things were safe when they weren't. Maybe the monitoring was wrong or it was broken. Or maybe we didn't test enough. It becomes a team responsibility to make sure that things go right. It's not an individual responsibility. And there's a difference between feeling accountable for causing an issue and feeling blame for causing an issue. And it's important to make sure that you don't make people feel blamed for taking risks that the company and the team greenlighted, because it's not their responsibility at the end of the day. They can feel a certain amount of guilt for being accountable for that issue, but you shouldn't blame them. And continuing on from that, attitude of blamelessness you should be fostering, you should also focus on turning your failure into learning. It's important that we recognize that failure isn't absolute. It's not the end of the world. We fail probably dozens of times a day, and we don't always recognize it, but we learn from it. We do better the next time around. It's important to take the time after failure occurs to sit down and walk through it. Take that sprint retrospective model I talked about and take all that empathy and trust and the relationship you've been building with everyone and have an honest conversation around why this happened. Figure out what went badly, what went well, what can we do in the future. And most importantly, you should also think about what you got lucky with. What were the near misses we had in this situation? Dissect failure and learn from it. Foster a culture that promotes risk for the sake of learning. Everything we've been talking about throughout this talk kind of leads into this final topic. It's about feedback. It's specifically about negative feedback. We are going to use that relationship we built in honesty. We're going to use that psychologically safe environment we created in the last section. And we're going to build on the code review concept to really expand on how you give feedback, both positive and negative. Particularly negative. It's something that people find quite hard to do. It's quite hard to articulate and feel like it's okay to do. And a lot of this talk is about showing you that it is okay as long as you set the right foundation, you set the right expectations, and you also open yourself to the same feedback from people. Here are just some general tips about giving and receiving negative feedback, with a little bit about praise. So firstly, you should start by asking for criticism, not giving it. This is about building that relationship of trust. This is about making sure that people trust you to be sincere about your praise, sincere about your criticism, and to make sure that your intent is legitimate. Secondly, don't make it personal. The feedback should always be about the piece of work or the task. It should not be about the individual. It's not an individual failing. It's a task that isn't done to the standard you expect, or it's a mistake that was made that can be rectified. It's something that can be fixed, or it's something that can be honed so that it doesn't happen again. Thirdly, be as specific as you possibly can about both praise and criticism. Being specific about criticism builds a certain amount of credibility that reinforces that your logic is sound, that you have created and given criticism that is warranted and necessary. It also helps people learn and grow from it. And similarly with praise, being as specific as possible convinces people that you are being sincere and that it's warranted. That, yes, I deserve this praise, regardless of maybe how I feel about the situation. And fourthly, if you point out a problem, try to also offer a solution. It's not always possible to offer a solution, but if you do, you give someone something very concrete to fix or to look at in the future. It makes it much easier to grow and be better if you have a starting point, if you have a starting goal. So with the mini example we talked about before, where the clear solution was you need to work on your elevator pitch, create some fake projects and create 30-second or 20-second little pitches to explain those projects and practice it and try and hone that skill. It's a lot easier to do that because you already have that lily pad to leapfrog from. Moving on to specifically giving negative feedback, there are 3 things you need to keep in mind or to account for when you're giving it. Number 1 is emotion. You need to take the listener's emotions into account and not your own. This is again that theme of meeting people where they are to help them. You should be aware of what emotional state they're currently in, anticipate what kind of emotional state they may be in after you give the feedback, and remove your own personal stake in the feedback. If you are frustrated with someone or angry with someone about what they did or what has happened, you need to put those emotions aside. It's not about you, it's about helping them grow and anticipating their emotion and their feelings in this moment. Secondly, it's about credibility. You need to build credibility. We talked in the last slide about providing specific examples, And this is exactly why. You need to demonstrate a certain amount of expertise in what you are giving feedback about so that you can build credibility that this feedback is helpful and that it's authentic. You also need to show humility. Show that we are not perfect. You are not above or superior to anyone. You are just a peer who is trying to share some piece of life advice or life experience with someone else that they may not have. Thirdly, you need to show your logic. You need to show your work and how you reach the conclusion to give this piece of feedback. People need to be able to see if there are any flaws in the feedback you're giving or how you worked it out. There might be a misunderstanding. There might be an assumption you made. There might be a piece of context that is missing that you haven't taken into account because you don't know about it. And it's very important that you show your reasoning, show your workings out so that people can pick it apart and show you where you went wrong so that you can grow. This is another part about being humble about things. When people reverse feedback on you, you need to be willing to accept it. Next, when it comes to specifically receiving feedback, when you're on the other side of it, there are a couple things you can do. Number one is you can understand your feedback preferences. Understand how you prefer to receive feedback and make sure people know or you correct them. If you only prefer to receive it in a written form because it makes it easier for you to analyze, or you prefer to receive it face to face or over Zoom or through voice, make that known as much as possible so that people use the correct method to give you feedback so that you feel the most comfortable to grow from it. Secondly, you should listen, understand, and then thank the person for their feedback. At this point, by the time you start receiving feedback, you will probably have given some negative feedback and understand how hard it is to give feedback. It's hard to be critical of people because by human nature, we want to empathize with them and we want to be nice. We want to be kind and nurturing. And this goes against that a bit because you have to be a little bit aggressive, a little bit honest about the feedback you're giving. So you should thank them. And you should try your best to listen and understand what they're saying because it's hard. It was probably very hard for them to work up the courage to give you feedback. Thirdly, don't react in the moment. Take some time to gather your thoughts and process the feedback. Understand it as much as possible. Which leads into the last point. Ask for clarifications or examples where you can. You don't always get enough information to understand why the feedback is coming to you. So you should ask for clarifications. Ask for specific examples so you can get the most learning out of this moment, out of this feedback. So we come to the end. This is the outro. I've compiled a list of some further reading if you're interested in any of the points I made today. Number one is Give and Take by Adam Grant. It's that book I talked about at the start. Secondly is Radical Candor by Kim Scott, which is that concept of honesty and bringing your whole self and challenging directly, but with empathy. Thirdly, Tanya Riley has a really great talk called Being Glue, which I really like. It's about praising the work that goes on between the work, which is just generally really important. I highly recommend checking it out. There's this great article by Alison McMillan about getting feedback. It's what I based a lot of the feedback section on in this. Fifthly, there is a great article by Sarah A. Soule and Brian Walker about changing company culture that requires a movement, not a mandate. Because a lot of this and a lot of what I talk about is a cultural shift, a cultural change. And it's very important to understand how to do that and how to do it well. And finally, a bit of self-promotion, but this is my own article about psychological safety. It's an intro to psychological safety and understanding it with some tips on how to build it and sort of understand it a bit more. I highly recommend it. I think it's a good one, I promise. And so we reach the end. In summary, kindness is about communication. It's about honesty and safety. It's about meeting people where they are to help them, taking their life experiences, their personal preferences into account when you communicate with them, when you give them feedback, and when you try to make a culture that makes them feel safe. If you'd like to talk more with me about this, you can find my Twitter and LinkedIn there in the slide, and my email if you want to reach out. There's also a link to these slides if you want to check them out. They're my reference slides, so they include some of my speaker notes. And finally, I want to leave you with one question. The one question of today, if you walk away with nothing else, is I want you to think about how can you be kinder?